Welcome and thanks for watching. This is the biggest story the media didn't want to cover. Maybe they were even paid off by the US government. Meet Fat Leonard, the man at the center of the scheme that rattled the US Navy to its core. With hundreds of millions of dollars on the line, Leonard bribed and corrupted Navy officers to turn a blind eye to his tactics. But my friends, this is just the tip of the iceberg. Subscribe to this channel now. I'm working on some even bigger stories. And now, your feature presentation. Leonard Glenn Francis, a man of rather rotund stature. He is widely known as Fat Leonard, a Malaysian national and the CEO of Glenn Defense Marine Asia, or simply GDMA. It's a company that provided logistics support to the US Navy in Asia. And as for Leonard, he used his connections and influence to bribe and corrupt hundreds of Navy officials, scamming the government out of millions of dollars in Pentagon contracts. The investigation into GDMA began when the US Navy conducted a routine audit of their contracts, which revealed something rather suspicious. Dozens of inflated invoices with hundreds of upcharges for services and goods. The initial discovery sparked a deeper investigation, leading to the discovery of the decade-long pattern of fraud. The audit also revealed that several Navy officials accepted bribes and kickbacks in exchange for prioritizing GDMA to receive contracts and ignore the fraudulent billing practices. The Navy immediately reported the findings to the FBI and the NCIS, or the Navy Criminal Investigative Service, who then launched a joint investigation. There had also been a tip received from a GDMA competitor, which helped to kickstart the investigation, and it quickly uncovered evidence of widespread corruption and fraud. Undercover agents, wiretaps, and the examination of thousands of documents were all part of this investigation. The scale of corruption is mind-boggling. Fat Leonard enticed Navy personnel, including high-ranking admirals, into illicit relationships over a period of several years, providing them with sex workers, hotel stays, and even concert tickets, all in exchange for classified information and exceedingly overpriced contracts. You see, GDMA played an important role in supplying logistics support to the US Navy in Asia. The United States Navy's operation in the region included the 7th Fleet, which patrols the Pacific and Indian Oceans, and it relies heavily on contractors like GDMA for things like food, fuel, and transportation. With Leonard's ingratiation of naval leadership, nearly every officer in the Pacific Fleet during the 2000s and early 2010s, whether honorable or otherwise, fell under the large, scandalous shadow that Leonard had cast, and not because of his rotund nature. The cost of the scandal to the US Navy and taxpayers is estimated to be around $35 million. Fat Leonard bribed and corrupted hundreds of Navy officers to ignore his systematic overcharging of the US government on hundreds of millions of dollars in Pentagon contracts. This continued for decades. The use of sex workers and other illegal activities to entice Navy personnel into illicit relationships was just one of the most egregious examples of Fat Leonard's strategies. In exchange for classified information and inflated contract pricing, Leonard provided Navy personnel with sex workers, hotel stays, and concert tickets. This type of corruption not only violated the law, but it also jeopardized the integrity of those Navy personnel. In order to facilitate this ring of corruption, Leonard used middlemen and even foreign officials. He bribed foreign officials to ignore the inflated invoices and forged documents. This allowed Leonard to keep control of the contracts while at the same time avoiding detection. GDMA would submit bills for goods and services that were in far excess of their actual cost, and the Navy would pay without question. This practice was so widespread that GDMA was able to charge the US Navy for millions of dollars in goods and services that were never actually delivered. Kickbacks were also an essential part of GDMA's corrupt practices. Leonard would pay off Navy officials, including senior officers, to ignore the exaggerated charges and the falsified documents. Cash, gifts, and other perks such as trips, luxury goods, and even access to sex workers were used as kickbacks. Inflated pricing and kickbacks diverted funds away from critical needs like ship repairs and maintenance, ultimately undermining the Navy's readiness and making a mockery of the procurement process. Leonard was finally arrested in September 2013 in San Diego, California, where federal agents lured him to a hotel. He initially cooperated with the authorities, providing evidence against dozens of Navy officials. In January of 2015, Leonard pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit bribery and defraud the United States. The allegations leveled against Leonard and the Navy officials involved were serious and far-reaching. The U.S. Department of Justice filed 45 criminal charges against Leonard and the GDMA, as well as dozens of Navy officials. The charges were bribery, conspiracy, fraud, and money laundering. Leonard faced up to 20 years in prison for each count of bribery and fraud, and up to 10 years for each count of money laundering. Leonard also faced the forfeiture of assets and property obtained as a result of his illegal activities. As for the Navy officials involved, many were charged, convicted, and sentenced to prison. They were dishonorably discharged from the Navy, and their pensions and benefits were forfeited. Some officials were cleared of wrongdoing altogether, and even had charges dropped, by simply cooperating with the authorities. But the stain of association with Fat Leonard was not one that was easily removed. I think it's safe to say that those Navy dress whites are going to need a lot more than just a Tide pen. In response to Fat Leonard, the United States Navy made a number of changes to improve the contracting process and overall transparency. The number of audits and inspections were increased, and new policy and procedures implemented to prevent and detect corruption. The Navy also created new positions and offices to combat contract waste, fraud, and abuse. The effectiveness of these changes is still being evaluated, but the Navy is no doubt feeling a bit better. If you thought that Fat Leonard had been caught and the story ended here, well, you'd be mistaken. He was placed on in-home confinement under strict 24-hour security while providing evidence against corrupt Navy personnel. You might already know what happens next. On Labor Day weekend of 2022, Leonard cut off his ankle monitor and he fled his San Diego mansion. And get this, he had been planning his escape for months. He even had enough time and freedom on home arrest to enlist an entire network of associates to prevent his recapture. He eluded the U.S. authorities for 16 days, passing through Mexico and Cuba before being apprehended in Venezuela while attempting to flee to Russia. To track him down and apprehend him, U.S. authorities had to work with international law enforcement agencies like Interpol. He was recaptured in Venezuela, where he currently awaits trials and sentencing. The details of his escape remain unknown, but we know that he managed to hire private security guards to serve on his in-home confinement, aiding his escape. These guards were stationed in windowless garages with no night patrols and no visitors logs. The reasons for Leonard's escape are still unknown, but it is believed he was motivated by desire to avoid his impending sentencing and additional consequences of paying off the authorities. I might feel the same if the alternative was decades in prison. The ramifications of the escape were significant. His sentencing, which was scheduled for the coming weeks, was postponed, and it is unclear what effect his escape will have on the leniency of his sentence. Leonard's testimony was expected to be crucial in the securing of convictions in the ongoing cases against Navy officials. Furthermore, Leonard may face new charges for his escape, which could add to the already severe legal consequences faced. Leonard's escape may also harm the reputation and credibility of the U.S. government and military. The fact that a high-profile defendant was able to escape from home confinement despite the tight security measures in place raises serious concerns about the legal system's effectiveness in dealing with high-risk defendants in the U.S. The escape also emphasizes the difficulty in apprehending a wealthy and well-connected individual with international connections. Navy officials' involvement with Fat Leonard was a significant issue that contributed to the widespread corruption. Many high-ranking admirals and other officials were implicated in the scandal, either through direct participation in corrupt activities or through failure to detect and prevent corruption. Some of these officials were even in charge of GDMA's contracts and operations, but they failed to notice or report the suspicious activity. The Navy's response to the scandal was also quite inadequate and terribly slow. To address the corruption, the Navy initially took limited steps, such as putting some officials on administrative leave or conducting internal investigations. More serious actions were not taken until the FBI and NCIS intervened. Even back then, some considered the punishment for those involved to be lenient, with many officials receiving little more than a slap on the wrist. The Navy's response to the scandal was also chastised for a lack of transparency and accountability. Despite the large number of officials involved, the Navy's internal investigations were conducted behind closed doors, making determining the extent of the corruption and the Navy's efforts to address it pretty difficult. Furthermore, the Navy's failure to hold those responsible accountable was interpreted as a background of a larger problem within the organization, where a culture of corruption was allowed to flourish. Despite its massive scope, the scandal received very little media attention. There are several reasons for the Fat Leonard scandal's lack of media coverage. To begin, the scandal was complicated and nuanced, involving numerous actors and intricate schemes. As a result, it was difficult for the media to refine the key elements of the story and present them in an understandable manner. Because the scandal was primarily focused on Asia and involved US Navy operations in the region, it may have been less relevant to a domestic audience. The public's awareness and understanding of the Fat Leonard scandal were significantly impacted by the scandal's lack of media coverage. The public was largely unaware of the extent of the corruption and actions taken by the US Navy to address it without the scrutiny and accountability provided by the media. Because of the lack of public awareness, the Navy was under less pressure to take swift and decisive action against those involved in the scandal. The Fat Leonard scandal is a shocking example of the US Navy corruption and fraud. The question remains, how can such widespread corruption in government contracting be avoided in the future? And what other scandals are wreaking havoc as we speak? Watch these videos next to find out. Thanks for watching.